Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Emerald Ash Borer University. I'm Robin Usborne from Michigan State University, and I'm one of the coordinators of this program, along with my colleagues, Adam Witt from Purdue University and Amy Stone from The Ohio State University Extension. We hope you'll be enlightened with the great information you'll be provided on today's webinar. Eric McConnell from The Ohio State University is today's featured speaker, and his presentation topic is the economic impact and management of EAB and woodlots and classic wood utilization. Eric is an assistant professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as the Forest Products Extension Specialist with Ohio State Extension. He received his bachelor's degree in forest management from Louisiana Tech University and master's and PhD degrees from Mississippi State University in forest products and forest resources, respectively. We really do appreciate Eric's willingness today to share his expertise with us. You'll see the chat pod on the left of the screen. I just wanted to remind you that you are able to type comments and questions there. We will make a note of them while the presentation is going on, and Eric will be responding to the questions after his presentation so we can keep the flow of the webinar going smoothly. Please stay tuned till the end because we would like to get your feedback, and we'll be providing a link to a survey that we'd like you to participate in. As well, for those of you needing CEUs, your survey information is necessary for us to process those CEUs. The first 10 people to participate will receive an EAB goodie bag. And even if you've received the EAB goodie bags in the past, we appreciate your continued feedback on this webinar as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing this week at www.emerald-borer.info. You will also find the recordings for all previous EAB University webinars there. We always want to know how we can make these webinars better, so please give us your feedback. I want to thank you for attending today, and with that, I'm going to bring up Eric's presentation, and we will begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. Good morning, everyone, and we'll get started talking about this is a preliminary study that I looked at, just trying to get an idea of how better to pursue the economic implications of this insect. And so I just want to present today some of the results from this preliminary study where we conducted an input-output analysis looking at how emerald ash borer could be impacting Ohio's forest products industry and the overall economy. Just some background information. A lot of this you already know. When the emerald ash borer was found in the U.S. and millions of trees have been killed as a result of the insect. 53 million as of 5 years ago. I'm sure that number is much, much greater now. A colleague of ours here at Ohio State, Davis Sidner, who is an arboriculture specialist, he did a study estimating that the loss of ash trees in Ohio communities as street trees could be anywhere from $1.8 to $7.6 billion. Looking at stormwater mediation and such as that, in the urban street tree communities. Kovacs and others, they did another study and they estimated the mean discounted cost to communities to be a little over $10.7 billion. And they estimated that much of these costs were going to occur to communities in non-residential areas. And they cited Dr. Sidner's paper and they did a comparison of how he did his work, and they assumed that if all the trees were removed at once, it would impact communities somewhere in the tune to $25 billion. But these two studies and some of the other studies that have looked at it from this perspective have looked at it more on the communities, the urban community impacts, and then how the resource impacts the communities. Like I said, if you're familiar with the iTree model and all the uh, variables that they quantify with that. But to my knowledge, little has been done as to the effects on the forest products industry. And uh, maybe I'm a little biased because that's what I work in, but I feel that industry deserves equal treatment and how it impacts communities because the workers live in these communities. And so I felt that that deserved equal treatment as well. And so past studies over the last 10 years, a lot of good work has been done by the cooperating universities here with EAB University. Looking at the insect, its physiology, the mode of action, how the trees respond, and then the insects respond to the tree response. Really interesting studies. And there was a recent study that just published on inventory losses, looking at FIA data across time, and that was pretty interesting. And then the studies such as Kovacs and others, and then Dr. Sidner and his colleagues' works on communities. But the forest products industry, it significantly contributes to communities as well. The obvious that we think about is land and resource management, but the people that are employed in the industry, they also significantly contribute through their employment. The industry pays taxes, the individuals pay taxes, the money turns over in the community many times, and so our industry and then the money generated from the resource as well, which is what we're going to look at today, how that turns over in the community. So trying to look at it from a different perspective, that's what I was taking with this. And so, again, perhaps I'm biased, but I felt that this needs to be reiterated is how the loss of this resource is going to impact not just the industry, but the communities that the industry resides in. And so, again, this was just a kind of a first stage, me just trying to wrap my hands around uh, really, is it worth pursuing further and then how to pursue it. And I can be honest, from this small study right here, I've generated more questions myself than answers. And the questions get pretty complex. And so I wanted to boil this down um, to try to just get a handle on where I need to go and where I need to look for help from others to help get the more complex answers. And so I wanted to determine if there were any significant effects to the economic contributions of forestry in communities by looking at two variables. And one was the delivered price. You may see the term FOB. That's the delivered to market price of ash saw logs. And so primarily here in Ohio, timber is turned into lumber, and so that comes from saw logs. There's other types of log classes, pulpwood, veneer logs too, but for this study we just looked at ash saw logs. And then the second factor is the diminishing local supply of the ash saw logs. And so that would give us an idea of how much imports are having to make up for the loss of diminishing supply. So looking at the economic impact, we can look at it from a human perspective in terms of jobs and dollars, but we can also look at, how is the local supply impacting local communities and how are imports affecting that. And then look to see if there were any spatial differences in Ohio, which if you're familiar with Ohio from a forestry perspective, it's pretty spatially unique. And so here I use the three regions that are defined in the state's timber price report that I manage. And so Western Ohio, which is the primary farmland, so the forest products industry in Western Ohio is smaller, but there's still a significant industry there, particularly in Northwest Ohio, Defiance, Henry, Fulton. There's some several medium-sized mills there and a small logging industry, so they still contribute a significant amount. And then the other two regions are regions that you might be more familiar with. Southeast Ohio is primarily what we call primary processing, so converting the standing timber into lumber. Some of the largest sawmills in the state, let me turn on my arrow, are in these counties right here. This is kind of the primary wood basket in Ohio, along with Washington County. Northeast Ohio also has a very significant forest products industry just from the sheer number of mills. If you're familiar with the work of Dr. Matt Bumgardner with the Forest Service and Bob Romick, who retired from Ohio State, they looked at the Amish furniture cluster, which are these counties here. And so we have both primary and then secondary manufacturing in northeastern Ohio, where the lumber is converted and processed into furniture and other finished products. And so that was the goal of the first goal, excuse me. And then the second goal was I just wanted to see, how fast these changes in economic impact were occurring. And so economic impact is the way to define it is by doing what's called input-output analysis, or you may have heard input-output modeling. Basically, just tracking the turnover of dollars in the economy. So if we were to pass a dollar to one another until it left the room. And so that's what we're tracking. And so there are three measures of economic impact. The direct impact, which is the industry of interest that you're looking at. And so for this study, I looked at the logging sector, but it could be any number of sectors, or if you wanted to look at the industry as a whole, you could aggregate the individual sectors together. The indirect impact, that's the supply chain. So think about everything that you need to convert standing timber into a delivered log. So obviously you need timber. So that economic sector, timber production, would contribute. You're going to need equipment. So chainsaws, harvesters, skidders, loaders, trucks, trailers. They're going to need tires. You're going to need fuel, oil, other things. So everything that goes in to getting that timber to market. And then the third impact is what's induced by those activities, by the quote unquote force to market process, getting the timber to market. So how those employees spend their salary in the community. So they purchase a home, and then all the costs that go into upkeeping the home. They go to the grocery store, they go to the movies, go out to eat. All of that is economic activity induced by converting the timber into logs and delivering it to market. So you have the direct contribution, and then the indirect and induced. You may have heard the term spillover effects, and so that's what those are, spillover effects. And so you can add the direct, indirect, and induced together, and you can come up with the total impacts, or the total contributions that the sector you're looking at contributes to the economy. And so each of those impacts, the direct, indirect, and induced, can be measured by these four factors or economic indicators. Employment, which is in input-output analysis, is the number of full and part-time jobs. Labor income, which is wages and benefits paid to employees, plus income earned by sole proprietors or families that own a business. Then value added, which is wages and benefits, plus interest, profits, dividends, and then what's termed indirect business taxes. So that would be like sales taxes and excise taxes. And then the fourth is industrial output, which is the total value of production. And industrial output includes income and value added. That's components within industrial output. And so I've got that highlighted in blue. That's the response variable that I looked at in this study. So if you're not familiar with input-output analysis or input-output modeling, I'll kind of give you a brief overview. Like I said earlier, it follows commodity flows from producer to consumer. So the turnover of dollars until they leave your study area, be it a county or the state. And so just how that money turns over in Ohio, for example, until the dollar goes across the Ohio River into Kentucky or West Virginia. For this study, I used IMPLAN, which is stands for Impact Analysis for Planning. It's an economic software package, economic impact software package that is for sale by the IMPLAN LLC group. And so I purchased 2010 Ohio data at the county level. So part of my extension program is documenting the economic impacts of the industry in the state and the counties. And so I had purchased this data, and so that's what we used for this particular study. IMPLAN currently analyzes 440 economic sectors. At one time, older versions had over 500 sectors. So if you look at the Census Bureau and how they break the economic sectors of the U.S. economy down, IMPLAN over the years has combined and aggregated some sectors. So in the forest products industry, for example, sawmilling and wood preservation used to be, which the Census Bureau does count them as individual sectors, but in IMPLAN they are now combined. And so the data used by IMPLAN comes from various government agencies, and then the input-output tables are developed following the Bureau of Economic Analysis methodology, excuse me. And then impact is determined based on a series of multipliers. And so you may have heard of economic multipliers. Well, that's what's produced from the input-output models. And so each of your four indicators has multipliers associated with it. And so you've probably seen this before, you know, for every one job in the forest products industry, 2.2 jobs are created elsewhere in the economy. And so that's based on an economic multiplier, which would in that case be 3.2. So one job in forest products creates 2.2 in other economic sectors. And so whenever we're determining economic impact, there's three ways that we can do it. If you look at many of the state extension services that have determined the economic impacts of agriculture or forestry, they usually use option number one. They determine the total impacts on the economy. And so in Ohio, when I updated it, it's right at $22 billion. But what you're assuming is those relationships, the transactions, the buying and selling between all the sectors are constant and remain constant. Well, we know the world's, you know, a very gray place. You know, things aren't constant. Things change. They're dynamic. And so really that $22 billion is like me taking a picture. It's a snapshot of one point in time. And that's really all you can say it is. The second way of determining impacts are what we call the marginal impacts, and that's based on the economic multipliers. So we can determine it on a per dollar basis. So for every $1 forest products generates, it generates $2.2 elsewhere. So the economic multiplier would be 3.2. And so we can report the economic impacts that way as well. The third way the way that we'll use today is the incremental impacts, which is based on a per unit basis. And so for this study, I determined the incremental change to the logging sector. And so I evaluated the delivered price based on a million board foot basis. And you're probably familiar, we usually report it on 1,000 board foot basis. So BF stands for board foot, which is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1. The M is a Roman numeral for 1,000. But when we do economic impact in forestry, we report it on a million board foot basis. That way the numbers that you're generating are big enough to register with you. And so by evaluating logging, that kind of gives us an idea as a whole of the health of the forest products industry, because we can evaluate the industry's demand for the ash logs. And so by looking at just logging, we can kind of get a gauge on the industry as a whole. So the questions I asked were, how would the changes in the price paid for salvage affect economic impact? So when the insects infest the trees, the tree response over time, the quality is going to be impacted as the wood degrades. And so you're not going to get full market price for it. So how does the salvage price affect the total economic impact? The second was, as the local supply diminishes, how much are imports going to have to make up for that? So how is the change in local supply affecting the local economic impact? And then the third question is just looking at, does it exhibit regional differences here? So I performed an incremental economic impact analysis looking at the delivered price of a million board feet of saw logs. And so I keep up with the timber price report, and we have developed, based on the individual species, a quote unquote composite price for a typical stand of timber. It's basically a weighted price. And so that weighted price is based on the species distribution according to the Forest Service FIA report. And so for the state of Ohio as a whole, ash saw timber makes up just barely over 8% of the total of the 10 species that we track. The delivered log prices are statewide prices, so that's one limitation in this study. I've worked here 3 years. This is based on 2010 data, so I didn't have the back data from the timber price surveys to get individual prices to where we could spatially separate the prices out by region. I do have those now, and so we can refine these results now. But that's one limitation that I want to point out in the study, is that the delivered log prices are based on statewide prices. And so the weighted price in 2010 was $345,000 per million board feet, or $345 per thousand. So when I was designing all this, there's a number of different ways that it could be done, but I wanted to look at it in the declines of ash log price. So how does ash contribute to that total weighted price? And so I looked at it in 20% increments. That way I could generate numbers, big enough to get an idea, but then they resonate with you. And so what I did was take 20% of that number right there of the prices. And so this is where this comes from. So the 345 is essentially a control. That's the market price of delivered timber. And so the 338 was taking 20% of the price out of this. So this was the weight for the ash price. And so it goes in 20% increments. So with no ash, the delivered price is $313 per million, or $313 per thousand. Again, this is a preliminary study, just wanting to see what was out there. And like I said, I've generated more questions myself than answers probably. So we're kind of looking at a gross effect at this point. So I didn't look at replacement species to see, well, obviously there's probably going to be a net effect because, for instance, ash is a white wood. Could we harvest more maple, which is another white wood, to make up for it? Well, which ones? Hackberry is a replacement for ash in some areas. Not so much Ohio, but in some areas. So which species are replacement species? How much are we going to harvest? What's the demand out there, number one, but then what can the land handle? Very complex questions that I'm I'm not ready to answer right now with this study. And so again, the incremental change to commercial logging. The second variable was the local purchase coefficient. So how much of the logs being delivered to a mill are supplied locally? So based on those three regions, how much of the ash being delivered to mills in those regions is coming from that region? That's what the local purchase coefficient measures. And it's a percentage, so it's a number between 0 and 1. And so if we just take 1 minus the LPC, that gives you an idea of how much is being imported. So if I want to look at Southeast Ohio, well, how much ash is coming from Western Ohio? Or how much ash is coming from neighboring states? And so defining the LPC, we can look at the total impact. So that total impact number, that 22 billion for Ohio that I mentioned earlier, we usually keep the local purchase coefficient at 1 because the wood, whether it's coming from Ohio or West Virginia, for instance, it's employing Ohioans. And so we're wanting to determine the economic impact of the wood itself, not really concerned about where it comes from. So that 22 billion is kind of looking at it from a human perspective. But here, I wanted to look at it from a resource perspective. So I looked at the distribution of the LPC, which again, I used the FIA data and assumed that it was equal to the forest composition. And so I reduced the LPC by these amounts in 20% increments. So for the state as a whole, just over 8%, I considered that 100%. So that would be my control for the state, and I stepped it down. Again, here are the price reporting regions in Ohio. Western Ohio, more farmland, more urban metropolitan areas. But there is a good forest industry in this area here. Southeastern Ohio, again, primary processing in these areas right here. And then there are some large sawmills in Washington County as well. And then Northeast Ohio has a good mixture of both primary and secondary processing. So for this study, I wanted to try to control everything as much as I could. And so I used analysis of variance and fixed the effects just again so I could see, well, what is happening and where do I need to go from there. In the real world, again, we know the effects are going to be random uh, because it's all very dynamic on how it's happening. But I just kind of had to get a grasp of what was going on. And so I used ANOVA to look at the significant effects on industrial output, on the total impact, so both the direct and those spillover effects, the indirect and induced. And so I looked at it due to price, so how is salvaging affecting total economic impact? And then how is the diminishing local supply, that local purchase coefficient, affecting total economic impacts? And then I just used my regions as a block to account for the geographic variation. Using ANOVA, there's a number of different means comparisons you can use. You're probably familiar with Tukey or Fisher's. I use the Chaffee test, Chaffee's minimum significant difference test. Of all the tests, it's the most conservative. And so I wanted to be sure, if there's a difference there, that, it's supported. And then I tested all the effects at the alpha level of 0.05. And so just to kind of give you a big picture of what happened, significant differences were observed between the regions. Differences were observed between the levels of price. So once we start salvaging, we saw a significant effect. As the local supply goes down, so as imports become a greater component, we saw a reduction in economic impact. There was no interaction between the price and the LPC, which kind of makes sense because the price is the price, whether the wood comes from Ohio or Michigan or West Virginia. The mill's paying a set price. And so the greater effect was observed due to price rather than LPC. So this is just a graph looking at the regional differences. And so based on the descriptions that I gave you of the regions earlier, forest products industry as a whole generates the greatest impact in northeastern Ohio. And then southeastern Ohio, because it's primarily the primary processing, so logging and sawmilling. There are some mills that have drying facilities, but the one limitation in southeastern Ohio is that lack of value added, that lack of secondary manufacturing. And so that's why northeast Ohio is generating a larger impact, I feel. But southeast Ohio is very similar to the state as a whole. And then, not surprisingly, western Ohio is generating the least amount of economic impact per million board feet. This is looking at the price. And so here's my control. This is the weighted price. So in 2010, a typical stand of timber of average quality was generating 345,000 per million board feet. So this would be the market price of standard quality timber. But as we start salvaging, you can immediately see a significant loss in economic impact. And so this 345, that's generated by the logging sector. Total number is right at $383,000. So the direct impact is $345,000. We're generating another $37,000 to $38,000 in indirect and induced impacts, to give you an idea. So we're looking at the total impact of industrial output. So 345,000 in direct impact, and then an additional, if my math's right, 38,000 in indirect and induced impacts. And then as soon as we start salvaging, we see that decline. Now from 80 to 60%, which is 332,000 per million, they're statistically similar. But then once we go down to 40, and then we step down again to 20 to 0. But the important take-home message for me was, as soon as we start salvaging, we see a decrease. Economic impact due to local purchasing, not as great as because of the price, just over 375,000. And we can see the local supply, you don't really start seeing an effect of diminishing supply until we lose 40% in this case. So once we get down to 60% of local ash, that's where you start seeing an effect, and then it steps down. But you can see these means are what we call chained together. And because we're looking at two variables in space, we can make a surface. And so this is what it looks like. And you can see the effect due to the price is steeper than the effect due to the amount of local ash supply. And because there was no interaction, it's flat. If there was an interaction, there would be a hump or a dip somewhere in this surface. So the conclusions, big picture wise, each region's total outputs were affected differently. And overall, both the price paid and the amount of local ash affected the total economic impact, again, on a per million board foot basis. The effects were independent of one another. And then, we saw decreases for both variables. And of the two, price had the greater effect. So how fast were they changing? That's what I wanted to look at next. And so determine the rates of change for industrial output, for the total economic impact of industrial output, based upon changes in the delivered price and the local purchase coefficient. So I compared each of those three regions to the state as a whole, and then each of those regions, I compared them to one another. And so I just used standard price trend analysis, auto regression, and then we use dummy variables to account for the regional differences. So I used one region as a default and then would code the other region as a 1. And we could look at how those regression lines were different. So were the intercepts different and the slope? And that's what we were interested in. And so this tells us the rate of change related to price. So for every 1% reduction in price, you can see the economic impact is only reduced by about 0.1%. And so going back to the earlier experiment, if you look at it on a 20% decrease basis, total state output decreases about 1.68%. But even though, a tenth of a percent, you say, well, that's not big, it's statistically significant. And the delivered value of logs in Ohio in 2010 was right around $220 million. And so, again, if my math's right, that's about $200,000, I believe. For Western Ohio, it was the smallest, and then Northeast and Southeast. So each of these rates were statistically significant individually. And then each of the regions were different from the state, and they also differed from one another. So here's what kind of got my attention based on the local purchasing. So you can see each of them, again, individually, we're getting a significant, the rate itself is significantly decreasing. But the largest effect by far was in Western Ohio. Now, going back to that earlier graph, Western Ohio on a dollar percentage, it's not generating, it's generating the smallest economic impact. But from the supply of ash as it's distributed throughout the state, the largest supply of those three regions was in Western Ohio. And so, from an absolute dollar sense, yeah, the economic impact is less in Western Ohio, but the rate of decrease in that number is much greater than it is in the other two regions. And so, again, if we use the 20%, you can see the rate of decrease is 2.6% in Western Ohio as compared to 1.7 for the state as a whole, which accounts for Western Ohio and the other two regions. Northeast and Southeast, the composition of ash in those regions is not nearly as great. So it's much smaller in Northeast Ohio. And then Southeast Ohio has a relatively, ash is a smaller contributor to the forest there as well. And again, each of those differences were different. So each region was different than the state, and then the regions were different from one another. So the conclusions, the decrease in the rate of change in the economic impact due to both price and LPC for Ohio as a whole, they were fairly similar. But the loss of that local supply in Western Ohio is a really big deal, much more so than the price. And that's just because the forest composition as a whole in Western Ohio, those mills rely much more heavily on imported wood than southeastern or northeastern Ohio. Because they're much more forested, there's more timber, there's more logging and sawmilling activity in these regions. And so the price has a bigger effect in the forested regions of Ohio, whereas the supply of the timber has a greater effect in Western Ohio. And so that's the conclusions of this preliminary study. Again, it's kind of opened my eyes, especially the the differences in these numbers here are what really opened my eyes. And then really it's generated some very complex questions that I'm asking myself and trying to figure out the best way to answer them.
Thank you, Eric.
Without
I think
rambling
we're open
anymore,
for
if
questions here
there's any
anytime. If you just want
questions,
to type them
I'll
into the
try my
chat
best to
pod,
answer them. Thank you very much.
you can. I'd also suggest that if you think of something later on, if you'll check the note box down at the bottom of the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see I've put some information there as far as Eric's email and my email as well. So just so you know that, I'm going to have this open here for a couple of minutes, and we are going to put up a slide here also to get your feedback and do a survey. Come on, it should be coming here pretty quick. There we go. Alrighty.